Stephen, thanks for joining us today. As we've discussed in the office before, operating expenses and tenants' requirement to cover those operating expenses is always a challenge and a frustration with most of our clients, and it's becoming more and more of an issue as landlords have become craftier in burying things in the operating expense provisions of leases. So we just wanted to get you to join us in this conversation today. And for those that don't know, Stephen Hazen, he has filled a sales manager role at our company. He's also senior vice president here at Oxford Partners, managing several of our agents that are new to business, and actually has a unique history in operating expense reconciliation. So wanted to just take the opportunity to invite Hazen to this conversation. So thanks for joining, Hazen.
No, I appreciate you. Appreciate the time to be here.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start in the world of commercial real estate. We're going to focus on office and industrial. There's lots of different lease structures, as you have triple net leases, full service, also known as gross leases. You have modified gross, industrial gross, base rent plus electricity, single net, double net, all different types of definitions. But we're just going to focus on the industrial or the triple net leases and the full service gross leases. And as there has been a huge trend, a shift from gross leases to triple net leases, not only in our local area, but also nationally, and not only in industrial buildings, but office, and not only class A buildings, but A, B, and C buildings. We're seeing a shift. And most landlords will argue it's simply a cleaner accounting process to switch from a gross or full service lease to a triple net lease because there's no longer expense stops to track. And it's just easier from a underwriting perspective. And that's certainly true, but that's not the only reason that they're switching over to the triple net leases. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. I would say the biggest difference between a triple net lease and a gross lease is that when you're entering a triple net lease, it transfers 100% of the risk and operating expense increases during year one onto the tenant. There's lots of downsides, but to me, that's the biggest downside. And the reason that most landlords are switching from gross leases to triple net is because a landlord might say the operating expenses are estimated to be $8 a foot per year. And so that's what you estimate. And then you go in and they actually end up being $10 a foot. Whoops, landlord underestimated it. And so that $2 delta is now the tenant's problem their first year in a lease. Whereas in a gross lease, the landlord has to absorb that cost because they agree in a gross lease, whatever their operating expenses end up being the first year of occupancy, the landlord pays for that. And then any increases over, that's like the ceiling, and then any increases over that amount are then at the expense of the tenant. So I think, and lots of downsides, but that's the number one reason. Anyways, transitioning on, Hazen, I know obviously you have a deep history in doing the operating expense reconciliations. Can you just talk a little bit about how those work and why there's always these surprise operating expenses that most tenants see in the springtime?
Well, I don't know if it's really particularly related to springtime other than just the taxes. So, of course, in states like Texas that don't have state income tax, the property taxes that's how the state funds all their operations. So they can go up, and of course, there's no caps. They can go up exponentially year over year. And that's the biggest problem I've seen over the last four to 5 years. But really in the last 2 years, insurance has taken the front runner to expenses being the problem for landlords and tenants, given the history of hurricanes and extreme storms, one way or the other. Insurance has become almost a deal breaker from my understanding of multifamily, which I don't practice very much, but industrial, it's certainly, we used to dial it in at 2 cents per square foot per month. That number no longer is relevant. It's more like 5 to 6 cents or 3 times as much. And there doesn't seem to be an end in sight to the increases. So landlords, when you have the two major components of the triple nets, the taxes, the insurance, the CAM being the other part, it's the landlords can't absorb that cost year over year without understanding that they can pass through some of it, because the lenders won't like that. And if you jeopardize the debt service, then lenders won't cash out to the landlord. So the tenants are going to have to absorb some of that. And that's the trends we're seeing, either gross or triple net, is that everybody's got to pay to play the game. And it's insurance is definitely something that's on the radar for everybody these days. Insurance expenses, really.
Yeah, correct. And I would say some top points on that, though, and this is more achievable in office and industrial, but we do it in industrial, is most tenants will just sign the lease, not understand that there's any type of controls that you can build into that. A big part of what we do, tenants need to go, is you can negotiate caps on those operating expenses. And there's some devils in the details we won't go into here on what's a controllable and a non-controllable expense and which expenses that you can cap. But there are operating expense components that you can place annual caps on to keep the landlord just going to get completely out of control on that. And then also rigorously negotiating the operating expense provision in the lease. Most landlords play by the generally accepted customary rules, but not everybody. And so you need to really look and see what's in the language that you're only passing on costs associated with the operations of the property and not any ownership, and that you can't pass on capital expenses, for an example, fully. Either you can't, or those have to be amortized over the useful life. And you could go on and on. There's all kinds of devil's in the details, but there's all kinds of restrictions that you could negotiate. Again, I know this is related to operating expenses, but not really. And in my view, this is the biggest gotcha in industrial. Can you talk a little bit about the HVAC responsibility and how you can limit
the HVAC or climate controlled HVAC are one of the same, but essentially climate controlled is a little bit less of a cost because you're just really pulling the humidity out of the air, especially down in areas like Houston. But the HVAC provision, the equipment can cost upwards of millions of dollars, and the bills on those things can be extremely high. But for tenants, what I don't like is that a lot of these tenants, especially running CNC machine shops, their machine warranty depends on the HVAC system running. So you've got this multi-million-dollar equipment with $1 million worth of AC running it. If that AC fails, then if you have to go back to, if it's a landlord responsibility and it happens at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday and you're running multiple shifts, you as the landlord should have control, or you as the tenant should have control over that versus the landlord, because you can't have them interrupt the business to deal with it if the landlord's not responsive because they don't want to deal with it or a variety of reasons. That can get pretty hairy situations. So when you're negotiating the caps on those, I think the tenants need to be aware that if it's critically important for them to function as a business with the HVAC system, they really should take on the responsibility of having it, maintaining the equipment. And typically landlords and tenants will share in the cost of a monthly maintenance program where somebody's coming out, looking at the system, making sure it's running properly. And that way, these big capital expenditures that happen typically on an emergency basis and on an opportune time, really, that's what really frustrates everybody, and everybody starts pointing fingers and wanting everybody to write checks. And at the end of the day,
Right.
the maintenance program that the tenant takes on as well, or even gets buried into the rate, is a much better way to manage those expenses than just the caps.
But if they do break, of course, that's a great business case for being responsible for the HVAC units. But then if it breaks, even if the tenant controls that repair, who actually is responsible for the cost? And if you don't properly negotiate that, 100% of the cost of replacing that HVAC unit, even if you're in the last year of your lease, is on the tenant. And so you have to
typically those caps come in. If the tenant takes over the building and there's an existing HVAC system and they're satisfied that it'll run what they want to run, this is above and beyond the office space, then the tenant and the landlord need to come to agreement who's responsible for it, what the caps are, like the agent system. And if there is a major breakdown of the system where it has to be replaced, that's the biggest component I've seen.
Right.
You can do stuff, but if it's 20 plus years, the free on a loan is probably more than the repairs. So it makes sense just to buy a new unit. Who's responsible for that? The landlord gets the luxury of depreciating it on an accelerated depreciation basis. So if the landlord can do it, amortize it in there, but then you go back to the caps for maintenance and expenses, when does that fall into place? Is it just repairs, or who's going to pay for the entire replacement of the system?
And then at the end of the day, it's all about predictability, right? And predicting operating expense surprises and increases down the line. And so that kind of leads to our next topic of how these leases are structured and how they impact predictability of their operating expense budgeting. And I would say the dirty truth in any scenario is that when you're leasing space, you are foregoing some control and future operating expense increases. I know back way before our time, used to be a flat rate, the entire lease. Any increases would be the landlord's expense. And then just as the industry has evolved, they push more and more of that onto the tenant. I would say that there is risk in both full service leases and triple net leases, but more so in triple net leases, particularly in industrial, because in industrial, typically the tenants are responsible more, not only for the taxes and insurance, but also the maintenance of the property, other than maybe foundation and roof. And we might talk a little bit more why landlords are starting to even push roof repair and sprinkler upgrades more onto the tenant when they didn't in the past. But the industrial tenants are typically more responsible for that. And with that comes an increased risk. So that's just important to note. But what I would say is more important and why you'd use an agent, someone that's very knowledgeable on this, is that either it be a gross lease or a triple net lease, these buildings cost money to operate. And there's lots of reasons that they continue to become more expensive, but taxes and insurance, for example, have become a huge problem. And I think we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, but it's become a huge problem. And us as educated, thoughtful, experienced agents, when we're touring around, can identify the landlords that are underestimating their operating expenses. It happens all the time. You might be in an office building that's pretending that the operating expenses are $8 a year. So that's what they're marketing when we know it should be 10 or 11. Or an industrial, they might be marketing 18 cents a month operating expenses when it should be north of 30. And so we know this happens, and sometimes intentionally. The landlords will convince tenants to sign leases in their buildings under false pretenses. And then once they move in, that first week is surprise, sorry, we were wrong. This is all your expense. So when you're evaluating property to property and putting together the different financial comparisons, you shouldn't just take the landlord for its word. You should actually estimate up the operating expenses in a building when we think that like maybe some games are being played.
Tenants need to use a broker. Certainly the biggest thing in office to be aware of is if your office, say for instance, is 80% unoccupied, and say you only occupy 5% of the floor plate of the whole building, then you need to make sure you're only paying 5% of those expenses. So you're paying for common area things like elevators, possibly security to monitor everything, landscaping for the whole place. I've seen a lot of landlords try to push the majority of those expenses onto tenants when it's because office has clearly had its challenges the last few years, especially since COVID, that they're trying to push a lot of those operating expenses onto the small group of tenants. You want to make sure that your brokers negotiate where you're only responsible for your share. Otherwise, a lot of these bills have gone in foreclosure because it simply costs too much to operate versus the income that they can produce. And they're trying to push that burden onto the smaller grounds of tenants. And their language can get real tricky in there. And so you need to be able to know what to identify to make sure that you're only paying your share.
Yeah, we can't get started on the gross up provision and how confusing that can be and how landlords and agents alike don't even fully understand. It's a hard thing to explain, but that's an important one. We'll save that one for later. That could be a whole video on gross up provisions, but important topic. Stephen, can you maybe share a little bit about some unexpected capital expenditures and additional risks that you're seeing landlords push onto the tenant, like some changes, some trends that you're seeing?
One of the biggest things that I saw in the past, and I've actually dealt with on a tour this week alone, is that these older buildings that are obviously more attractive because the rent's cheaper, they don't have fire suppression or sprinkler systems in them.
Right.
And so the code comes up to where now, especially the Houston area, where even if you're not within the city proper, you're in the ETJ, the fire departments are going to require you, once the property changes hands, or if landlord, or if something happens, or really if they just feel like it, they're going to come in and make the tenant or the landlord, whoever is responsible, put sprinklers in the system. And it's probably 6 to 7 times the cost to put it in after the fact than it is to build it in when it's new. And if you're on like a well and septic system versus a public system that has pressure, the cost could be $10 to $12 a linear foot or higher. And if the tenant has that unexpected cost, that could be $500,000 or more, and they'll shut the building down. So we need to be very careful to make sure that we protect, and especially in single tenant buildings, we need to be able to protect our clients from that massive expense that I have seen almost crater one business. Everybody ended up working it out because at the end of the day, it does improve the landlord's building, whether they want to believe it or not. And so the landlord should bear most of that cost. Now we can amortize it and talk about some things that are reasonable, but that's the biggest one I've seen in industrial.
Yeah. And we can't name names, of course, but we were at the Oxford Partners Happy Hour, and we're having some issues with that right now with particular operators that are the strategy to acquire and then get the tenants to pay for that. So it's a real problem. And then a surprising one to me that's new that I've never saw, and then I've seen actually in the last 3 office leases that I've redlined. Landlords are now adding an additional insurance requirement for the tenant that in the event that their business fails, that the insurance will pay the remaining rental obligation, which is a new one.
Yeah.
And so they take their security deposit, they do their financial underwriting, they have legal recourse against the entity that signed on this lease, whatever its assets and accounts receivable are. And then plus and then it's hidden, burying it in that long provision that is just a pain to read. Their little
Right.
insurance policy for themselves is to even further mitigate their risk of default. And it's like the umbrella policies, these $5 million umbrella policies that landlords are asking. There's actually a notable additional expense. A lot of tenants sign the lease, and then property management circles up. Okay, where's your proof of insurance? Oh, you have to. It's like really making a lot of companies upset.
No, absolutely. That's just additional expense, and that's a unique policy. And I've seen that a lot. I think it's a lender-driven requirement. They're seeing if they can get away with it because what I've seen in the past is a lot of landlords would have to have some like income protection policy that covers the building in case an operator fails or goes bankrupt or something to that extent where it covers the majority of the income. Now what they're trying to do is pass that on to each of individual tenant. Let's just say they get 60 to 70% of the tenant mix to protect the income. That looks really good when it comes to underwriting for lenders. And I would love to be protected all the time, everywhere, but that's just not reasonable. I think it's an unreasonable expense to have tenants essentially have guaranteed income insurance for the landlord, which is an uncommon thing. The policies are expensive relative to any other insurance policy. And I think it's something that, although it sounds good from the landlord side, I think tenants should stay away from that. I don't think that's an additional cost that the tenant should bear to make the landlords feel better.
Yeah. Wanted to just pivot to maybe some horror stories, talk about
Sure.
things that have gone wrong. That's always interesting to hear about. So I have a couple examples. One of my favorites, we had a properly negotiated. One, we found a landlord doing something they weren't supposed to, but then two, we had some mechanisms in place that prevented them from doing this. But I had a client that got a surprise one spring, a surprise $28,000 bill for some costs associated with like property taxes, which are non-controllable. So typically the landlord can pass those expenses onto the tenant. And the reason the landlord was categorizing that is they're trying to get away with it. So there's a $28,000 bill, and we dug into it. And what it ended up being is that landlord paid their internal employees over a 5-year period, a clawback 5 years, to negotiate property taxes. And after a 5-year period, they were successful at getting a big tax refund from the city. And so they paid their internal employees, which you're not supposed to do, a 33% tax savings on that negotiation, right? And then try to pretend like that was categorized as a tax, even though it's more of an operations, and pass that on to the tenant. And so we got them two ways. We got them one that's borderline illegal, and you can't and you can't claw back 5 years. So no. But then two, that's not categorized properly. This is not a tax expense. It's an employee expense. It's an operating the building expense. So that goes in a different portion of the operating expenses that are controllable. And we have a 5% cap on the controllable expenses. So our first assertion was that actually we only owe a little bit. And then when we finished, the landlord owed them like $3,000. And so that was a fun one. And then another fun one was the landlord can include in operating expenses costs that are associated with operating the property. So that's normal. And so if there's some accounting expenses related to running the P&Ls for the property, that's included. And that's customary and that's fine. So one of my clients was in a building that this big landlord operator also owned. So they were a tenant in their own building. And they tried to pass on 100% of their software costs for their 32 buildings in Houston onto all the tenants in that one building that they happen to own. So we caught them doing that. Obviously, you can't do it.
Both of those examples are impressively creative. Yeah. Whether or not to get away with it is something, but you get the gray area of whether or not it's even legal to ask. But that's why brokers should be used, because you can absolutely protect people from those unknown scenarios. The horror story I've ever had was when I sold an investment property to someone, and then the tenants called me because I built some relationships with them probably within a year. And so what had happened, a lawyer group had driven by and got the building for all these handicap violations, ADA compliance stuff, federal level stuff. And then it was probably $250,000 to rehab all the stuff, with including attorney's fees to fight it. And the landlord wanted to pass that entire cost on to all the tenants. So they got assessed. This deal was over 8 tenants.
Oh, geez.
And needless to say, they got very upset. And the landlord ended up having to pay it. He readjusted his loan. Once he made the improvements, when he refied, he was made whole. But the landlord did try to pass that $250,000 fee on to the tenants, which also not only included construction, but he wanted all of his legal expenses on there. And he tried to associate that with operations, and that was not going to work. So my phone was just blowing up with tenants just upset, and they were like, how can I do this? And I'm like, I don't think he can. And then, of course, I represented the building as well in the sale, so it was straddling both sides of the fence, but we ended up working it out. But that I lost sleep for about a year going on because it took that
Yeah.
much to unwind all the stuff. And
And-
I didn't know there were these groups that would drive around and look for buildings that had violations, and then they would just sue the landlord arbitrarily. And then once it gets filed, they have to fix it all.
Right. Yeah. And the reality is you have good operators, you have what we would define as bad operators. And we see this happen because it's a gray area where you can, or even if you don't, you can't. A lot of tenants will just pay just because they're focused operating their business. They don't know any better and they just pay. Right. And my view, one of the biggest benefits of using an agent is that we're familiar with the good operators and the bad operators. We obviously show you everything,
Yeah.
but higher chance that you're going to have some issues in the future if you go to this landlord, less likely if you go to this other landlord. And there's no guarantees, but you certainly can mitigate the probability. And I think that kind of gets into like our final question. And Stephen, you want to talk a little about relationships, but why a strong tenant rep broker is crucial when
It's cool. There was actually a guy that was mentioned recently that you and I have talked about in the past that's under a ton of lawsuits. I think he's filed bankrupt. And the people like you and I won't do business with those kind of entities. And if you're just coming to the market, you're looking for 10,000, 20,000 feet of office or industrial, you wouldn't know better that the signs look good, the rates look good. You go in and you realize you've got this lease that can just chop you off at your knees. And
Right.
people think that tenant rep brokers or industrial representation is free. It's not. Of course, the landlord ends up paying for it. But you as the tenant benefit, the cost and the value really is in not just the market knowledge, but the personal relationships brokers have with landlords, operators, property management companies where we know to stay away from. We can stay away from high tax environments, like property taxes are really high here. They're not as high over here. Some people are aggressive over here. And then some landlords will actively fight the taxes, and they're good operators. Some landlords could care less. And so those are the things you can't quantify. You can't find it on ChatGPT. You can't find it on Google search. You can't find it on LoopNet. That's the market knowledge that folks pay for.
It happens. Actually, we'll conclude here, but I just got a call yesterday, actually, from someone that we know whose wife was looking for an office lease and was using a realtor. So nothing wrong with being a realtor, trying to play commercial real estate agent. And they felt like they were being underrepresented and their representation wasn't knowledgeable in what we do. And then the final straw was that they got a space that they were looking at lease from under them by another group. And it was because that agent didn't have a relationship with that landlord and didn't know what they were doing. And the moment that another tenant came by that had professional representation, we're just going to go with that group because they're going to be easier and more streamlined and don't ask for ridiculous things.
Absolutely.
What they do ask for is in line with customary. Even a lot of these things we talked about, it's like the landlords don't want to agree to it. But once you ask it, they're like, that's fair. You got us. And so just having somebody in your corner that can help you select the right landlords and then also know the things that you should negotiate for.
Yeah, you want to have a good tenant rep broker that has the package ready to go, the financials, the proper financials. You don't need to disclose everything, but everything in a nice, neat package to make it easy for the landlord. And it's our job to get that thing organized, ready to go, and present it to somebody to make their job easier so we can get the best price possible for the tenant.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right, that wraps up. Appreciate your time, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be on with our day talking about doing more exciting things than operating expenses, but certainly a very important and valuable topic. So thanks for helping us to make this video.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay. Thanks. See ya. Bye-bye.